Hello, team. Welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. Ukraine War News Update, second part thereof, for the 5th of February 2025. We're going to start this military aid video with the visit of Foreign Minister for the UK, David Lammy, to Kiev, where, as you can see, he's meeting the UK ambassador, uh, or the Ukrainian ambassador to the UK, Valery Zaluzhny, former commander in chief there. So, a show of strength and solidarity from Britain today amid fears Trump and Putin may do or have done a secret deal. Indeed, there is news coming out of the White House that they have begun negotiating with Russia. UK Foreign Minister David Lammy greeted by Zaluzhny, announces $69 million of more support, 17 million pounds of that 55 million pounds, of which supports sustainable energy projects in Ukraine. Interesting this because actually, what else do we have in terms of energy? Italy allocates over $2 million to strengthen Ukraine's energy system. The project, funded by the Italian government, aims to make Ukraine's energy system more resilient and decentralized. Something I've talked about since the beginning of the war. They need to decentralize the energy system. Need to get more renewables in, not so much from an environmental point of view, although that's obviously good, but actually from a decentralized energy security point of view. Now, I know that these kind of smaller, more localized production units aren't going to sustain, massive industrial output, but it's about, keeping hospitals running, schools running without drawing on the central system. And it's much more difficult to destroy Ukraine's energy when it's so fragmented like that. And I think as I said, I've been saying that for a couple of years. Well, it looks like this has actually been recognized because there are a lot of people who are now putting in efforts to see this through a decentralized energy system. But anyway, going back to Lammy, I think it's really interesting. I don't know if I've got it here. uh, no, this is well further to Lamy's visit. Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine has ratified a £2 billion loan agreement with the UK for defence. I don't know what underwrites that loan repayment. The funds are being will be used for the purchasing of air defence systems, missiles, and setting up repair bases for military equipment. And I wonder whether that'll be UK administered repair bases as well. Now, as someone says, UK is more reliable than USA. Well, actually, that's what I was going to mention. Part of why David Lammy appears to be there, and where was I? I was looking at this a second ago somewhere else. But here we go. Um, the UK. So, Ukrainian Foreign Minister Sabiha is hopeful for upcoming talks with the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio at the Munich Security Conference. But Sabiha at the moment is meeting with Lammy. The UK doesn't see Russia as being serious about negotiations with Ukraine. Quote, and the conditions that were set out by the Russian President Vladimir Putin last year was not any basis on which you could seriously expect a sovereign country to begin negotiations, says David Lammy. That is very different to where Keith Kellogg and Donald Trump are at the moment, which is very much on board with Russia being serious about doing negotiations. There are well, there are messages coming from Russia that they are ready to negotiate with Ukraine, but this is clearly going to be on Russia's own terms there. And I wonder whether David Lammy in the UK is just slightly saying here that we are serious in our support for Ukraine, even if the US isn't. And we're going to come back to the US because goodness knows what's really going on there. We're going to talk about Starlinks later as well. Some incredible news potentially coming out from there. But anyway, before we get there, a new survey shows 67% of Germans support military aid to Ukraine, 27% back increasing the support, while 40% think Germany should maintain current levels. Only 27% favour reducing arms supplies, so that's a clear majority backing continued assistance. That's really good news. The Green Party are on Ukraine's side, and actually something I was going to report later is that it appears that Russians have been sabotaging cars in Germany and then putting Green Party paraphernalia on them as if it's like the Green Party of Germany activists sabotaging petrol cars. Very clever of the Russians, if that's the case, because they know that the Green Party really supports Ukraine, so they can drive support away from the Green Party because it looks like their activists are going around sabotaging people's cars, stuff like that. This hybrid warfare is so effective from the from the Russians. But uh, the Poles, on the other hand, are seeing a decrease in support for Ukraine. So continued military support now is just under 50% from the Poles, and that's deeply, deeply worrying. Um, Latvia has begun producing Patria 6x6 APCs for Ukraine. The first batch intended for Ukraine's defense forces was showcased to the Ukrainian ambassador to Latvia. This is really good news. We've been wanting Germany's Rheinmetall to produce the what is it? The Lynx AFVs and then the Fuchs APCs are supposed to be on the cards as well. And those production facilities don't seem to have been created in Ukraine yet, but good if Latvia can help support Ukraine there, fantastic. Now, the ban on using Western weapons deep into the entire territory of the Russian Federation has been lifted, according to Defense Express, but Ukraine only has its own means capable of hitting targets of a distance of 2,500 kilometers. Well, um, yeah, I mean that's great, 2,500 kilometers. The problem is, the types of weapons they can get that far. What they really want is the ability to strike in with ATACMS deep well, not that deep into at a medium range into Russia, and they need the ATACMS to do that. And unfortunately, they just don't have that. I don't think Trump's administration is likely to be sending more of those unless there is some kind of buying. It's not. They're not going to come down from PDA or USAI. Initiatives, because even though the Biden administration handed over another $4 billion worth of PDA, or 2.8, there's differing numbers of what the Trump administration has at their fingertips. I don't think the Trump administration are going to sanction that. So I just think it's the end of US aid to Ukraine, unless it's really financially beneficial for the US to do so. Ukraine's armed forces received the Gimli ground robotic complex. It was interesting talking to the guys at the Wild Boar uh, drone workshop that we visited when I was out in Ukraine, and they were saying that it was absolutely condemning of wheeled drones. He said they get stuck, they're not very good. Obviously, horses for courses, they're on solid ground that's not sandy or muddy. These are going to be able to move pretty quickly. So in the summertime, probably pretty useful. But he was much more a fan of tracked vehicles. The Gimli Ground Complex is a versatile unmanned platform designed for high quality combat operations and can be equipped with weapons and perform the functions of a mobile combat module. So good news there. Now, the US provides 30% of Ukraine's weapons. So this is going back to the US. Domestic production covers 40%. This is coming from Zelensky. So you've got 30% US, 40% domestic, and then one presumes the remaining 30% other nations, mainly Europe, Japan, Australia, etc. Okay, so that 30% is incredibly important. You can imagine what would happen to us without this crucial 30%, said Zelensky in an interview with Piers Morgan. It's a really interesting nugget coming out of that interview that shows how important the US is. Although I would have to say that that's not as big a percentage as I might have otherwise expected. And this is probably partly because the Ukrainians themselves have reached the 40% of their uh, of the weapons they've received coming from within Ukraine. And I think there's a lot to be said for the support, the Danish model and the strategic industries minister, as well, former minister Commission is now doing strategic industries, but within Zelensky's own circle has become a closer aid to Ukraine. But the effort that's been put in to ramp up production within Ukraine, I think, is really significant, and it has possibly helped um, to have too help to move away from too much dependence on American aid. And given where we well where we think Trump might, who knows where Trump is and his team regarding Ukraine, given that lack of reliability and predictability, that's probably a good thing. Now, I talked about this previously, which was the stopping of aid to Ukraine as soon as the Trump administration took over. It's really interesting that people are talking about this in exactly the same way I mentioned as soon as this news came out. So, I often get the imposter syndrome. Do I know what I'm talking about? And stuff just tumbles out of my mouth, and I don't know whether I'm at all um, rational in what I'm saying. I hope I am. There's a lot of common sense, and I'm just putting two and two together. So actually, when proper analysts put this stuff together, and I've already said that, I feel vindicated. So that's good, just from a personal point of view. So Timothy Milovanov says exactly the same thing. When the Trump team took over, they stopped US aid to Ukraine, and although it was then turned back on this weekend, I said this is a really bad sign. And it's a really bad sign because it shows you that intuitively the Trump administration is not supportive of Ukraine. For them to come in and say, right, stop all help to Ukraine, right, until we worked out what's going on, rather than come in and say, right, that's already been apportioned, it's gone through Congress, that's all fine, that the MOD, the DOD has sanctioned this, is all good and proper. Keep that going. Now we need to work out what we're going to do next. Rather than do that, they said, right, stop that. Whoa. So Timothy Milovanov, who is from the Kiev School of Economics, former economics um, minister in Ukraine, said this is pretty bad news. Multiple sources told Reuters that US military aid to Ukraine was paused and then later resumed. It signals the absence of a clear Ukraine policy in the Trump administration, with factions split between halt all aid and strengthen Ukraine. And that's what I've said before, is that you have two factions. And the problem is a faction that is halt aid to Ukraine is the closest of concentric circles around Trump. That's the issue I have, is that the concentric circles outside of that, which will include Mike Rawls and then Keith Kellogg and even Marco Rubio, although I don't think they're perfect for Ukraine, they're at least somewhat better than the concentric circle right outside Trump. And then if you include adjacent people like Don Trump Jr., Tucker Carlson, Steve Bannon, all these other people, then I think Ukraine is really up against it when it comes to expecting continued support from the US, unless it's clearly transactionally beneficial to the US in a really prima facie obvious kind of monetary way. We're not talking about long-term strategies here. I don't think, long-term strategies, they've just disabled US aid. It's fascinating to see that in Izium, which is bombed to yesterday, one of the trucks helping to sort stuff out in Izium was a US aid truck. There ain't no funding for that going forward as it stands, or at least it's going to be wildly reduced. Because this is the unified executive theory of people like JD Vance and a Project 2025 lot, which is just strip out all the guardrails, strip out all the checks and balances, and turn the US into a form of dictatorship. And that's what we warned before the election. That's what I said was written into Project 2025. That's what JD Vance believes. That is what is happening right now. And none of that is good news for Ukraine. Okay, so Milovanov continues, these factions are fighting and the resulting policy is unstable, switching from stopping the military aid completely before the weekend to resuming it without limitations a few days later. This is not deliberate pressure tactic on Ukraine because, one, Zelensky already plays ball with any Trump suggestion, and two, the aid stop would be made public if Trump wanted to put pressure, similar to how he operates with Mexico, Canada, Colombia, or even USAID. The implications are severe. Putin reads these signs and understands that Trump doesn't have a firm view on Ukraine, which makes him, much more manipulatable by Russia. There are weaknesses, there are cracks there, there's uncertainty there. They don't know what they think as a unified administration. There are issues within that, and Putin will take advantage of that. Um, so Trump doesn't have a firm view on Ukraine and is open to influence. Furthermore, the option, and sorry to interrupt myself again, but this also goes back to Trump not having any ideology himself. I think Trump is largely an empty vessel that suffers very much from proximity bias. So the last thing that is said to him, because especially as he doesn't read, so we know that Trump doesn't read, so he's not going to form these opinions from doing his own analysis of reading stuff. This is really, really important. We need to understand psychology of world leaders here to understand why they come to certain decisions. We've seen Trump flip flop all over the shop, and the reason he flip flops is because he doesn't have ideology himself. And I'm sick and tired of idiots telling me that I've got TDS. If you tell me I've got Trump derangement syndrome, I'm going to ban you because it's lazy and it's pathetic. Like, I'm giving you substance for why I believe things. Like, this isn't irrational hatred of Trump. This is rational dislike of Trump for the reasons I'm giving you. Right? We know, like empirically, we know from all of the people that know Trump that he doesn't read. Right? he in the last administration, he did not read the daily intelligence briefings that had to be provided to him by the slideshow. And according to the people that put this together, you had to put pictures in to appeal to him, right? And they often had to be stuff to do with him as well, right? So he doesn't take intelligence briefings. So as the most important politician in the world, where does he get his knowledge from? So he's not reading it. When you read stuff, you take it in and you can reread it and you can go over it so you fully understand stuff. And then you can go, right, I understand this context a little bit more. I need to do a little bit more reading on that area of this geopolitical scenario. So you do your own research and you formulate your own opinions, although they will be somewhat dependent upon what you're reading, because, they will come with baggage and bias. When you are told stuff, then all you're learning is what you're told and nothing more than that, because you're not going away and learning more. So the limit to your knowledge is that which you are being fed verbally by people around you. That is a very, very thin veneer of knowledge, which is why when someone else comes along and tells you something different, you go, oh, okay, yeah, because you don't have the depth of knowledge to counter these kind of narratives. You are just susceptible to what the last person told you. And this is indeed what happens with Trump. We saw this when Zelensky went to speak to him and he changed his opinion. Then he goes and speaks to the same people that are around him. Then he speaks to Keith Kellogg. Then he speaks to people around him and he's flip-flopping, and his views on Ukraine are all over the shop, which is what Milovanov is saying here, which is reflected within the administration, because Trump himself doesn't have the robustness of ideology concerning Ukraine. And so therefore the administration's view of Ukraine is fractured, because actually there's a difference of opinion within the administration, and Trump is not leading that. He's not someone that's coming and say, I feel really strongly about Ukraine because I understand the geopolitical scenario. I've had a long and detailed understanding of global geopolitics in a way that Joe Biden, you can slag off Joe Biden all you like, but he understood stuff because he's been there as vice president, but also as a politician dealing with this stuff for 20, 30, 40 years, right? So he understands the context. Trump is a real estate magnate that doesn't understand this, doesn't read, accidentally gets voted in 2016, learns on a job, really doesn't understand politics to the depth that he needs, sees really strong dictatorial leaders, likes the fact they're strong men, and then goes and speaks to Putin in 2018 in Helsinki, and Putin convinces him, because he doesn't have that depth of knowledge, he goes in, speaks to Putin, Putin convinces him, he comes out, regurgitates Putin's talking points and slags off his own intelligence community, because he doesn't have that depth of knowledge. And here we are, 8 years later, or 6 years later, or 4 years after the last administration, his last administration, and we're back in exactly the same position. He's not learned anything else. He's just been surrounded by people with varied opinions, many of them really, really disgusting opinions about Ukraine, such as his own son and Tucker Carlson. Surrounds himself with these people, gets into power, appoints some people who are vaguely sensible, and then he can't drive them because he doesn't have that knowledge. So, furthermore, the option of abandoning Ukraine, making it weak and up for grabs for Putin, is a possibility. So Russia is going to be encouraged and might play this hand strategically, appeasing and flattering Trump, but hardening its position to a ceasefire in exchange for the military support to stop from the US. In the process, Russia will demand elections in Ukraine, which the US has regurgitated, and the US, see recent remarks by Keith Kellogg, appear to be falling for this trap too. A negotiated settlement, according to Russia, will have to wait until there is a new legitimate president, while the US will stop the military support during the ceasefire. The question is, you have to ask yourself why, after all this time, and the Biden administration never having mentioned this, the US never mentioning this at all, now that we know that the US administration is in talks with Russia, why it is now that Keith Kellogg has come out and said that Ukraine needs elections. That's come from somewhere. That's come from the Russians. It's that simple. This will open a range of policy options for Ukraine, from a continuity of the war against Ukraine without the US weapons, to a pause for Russia to regroup for the period of its choosing. Ukraine needs this pause anyway. With or without US support, Ukraine will work on restoring and reforming its military, rebuilding its economy, and improving its political system, building investment and support relationships with Europe and hopefully the US. This doesn't mean the end of Ukraine, not at all, but it means the war on the back burner being the best possible outcome. If the US and Trump change their views and move toward a strong support for Ukraine, a durable, sustainable peace settlement is possible. At this point, I think Trump and his administration are pretty unexpected, but also unreliable and inconsistent, and therefore Putin will be able to play the US to an extent. Thus, a de facto peace without guarantees to make it sustainable is the most likely outcome, the more likely outcome. Yet, Zelensky can make a difference in this process by rallying the EU support and being very strategic with Trump, offering him relationships and deals that can benefit the US. These options are limited, but better than Russia can offer because it lost all trust. Interesting analysis there from Milovanov. If Zelensky is successful and the Ukraine army holds a line, or the Russian brutal human meat waves offensive culminates, a stable peace is possible. Um, and then we hear this. So I think this looks like NBC probably. The bromance between Trump and Putin. Oh, yeah, it is NBC. God, funny, I know that from the color of the blue. The bromance between Trump and Putin has noticeably fizzled in the new term. So it's interesting that people think that Trump and Putin have a bromance. I mean, it's true. He likes a strongman dictator. Though Trump has yet to reveal the extent to which he'll pressure Russia to end the war, according to NBC News. Mike Walls and Keith Kellogg want to use American leverage to prod Putin to stand down. So Trump is talking tougher toward Putin, but he's yet to ratchet up assistance to Ukraine. Others favor cutting back the billions of dollars in assistance the US gave to Ukraine in the Biden administration as a way of forcing a swift end to the conflict. Critics of that approach say it would effectively disarm Ukraine and thus amount to a capitulation to Russia. We'll wait to see what happens there. And this is where people like Kaya Kallas and Donald Tusk and Emmanuel Macron within the establishment of the EU are really important. But then you have Russia's hybrid war with AfD and Rassemblement National and all these other movements in Europe, and the growing success of Reform in the UK. Reform have taken over as the leading party in the UK in polls. Luckily, Labour have a good few years left here, but I'll tell you what, the information attacks against Labour are huge, and a lot of them come from Russia. Just listening to my partner's father, listening to Nigel Farage spout stuff that was very susceptible to my kind of father-in-law, if you even want to call him that. But he's very much that way inclined. And I was in a lounge just going, just really rhetoric that was really kind of pro-Putin rhetoric, essentially, really undermining British unity and whatnot. And I think there are political challenges for Europe and for the UK if we want to step up, which I think we absolutely have to, in the absence of an American unified response. And before we get on to Starlink to talk about that, Anders Nielsen has just done a very good video talking about where we're at the moment and the risk of a Russia-NATO war, given that the US seem to have gone AWOL.
I think that these are some of the perspectives that it's important to keep in mind when we see what's going on right now with Donald Trump, and he's starting trade wars and threatening military action against the allies of the United States. Like this, it's not just something that's happening right here, right now. This is an entire world order that is being redefined, and in that chaos, there might be some areas where positive things can come out of it. Like there might be local actors that can get something useful out of this new situation. But overall, it's going to be more bad things than good things. And we are going into a period of more instability and more uncertainty. And it's important that we are aware of the profoundness of this situation and the urgency of finding positive solutions that can fill that security void that's there when there's now doubt about the commitment of the United States.
And the reason I'm including this in the military aid video is because this pertains to like NATO, and NATO being this deterrence organization, a defensive organization pitted against Russia. And if the US is effectively pulling themselves out of NATO, it's certainly in kind of rhetoric, and they pulled themselves out of United Nations human rights, they're pulling themselves out of WHO, Paris Accord, climate agreement. all of these international alliances, which US is an important, obviously an important member, then the world is going to have to adapt very quickly to the US not being a reliable partner, and that includes in assisting Ukraine. And Europe is going to have to step up and take over and eschew the US. And it's just an incredible time that we live in. So the beginning of this video is to do with the lack of deterrence now, that the US has proved itself to be an unreliable partner and therefore is not effective as a deterrent, and that will allow a vacuum, a kind of a deterrence vacuum, to take place that will facilitate Russia prodding and probing, and China as well. The incredibly dangerous time we live in now. Some news on Starlink, which uh, might be good news and might be absolutely terrible news. Not quite sure yet. So, Russian sources are reporting a massive deactivation of Starlink terminals along the length of the front line in Ukraine. They speculate that it's been ordered by Elon Musk and or Donald Trump. It's not clear whether the Ukrainians are also affected. I was going to talk. I meant to mention this about a week ago. My prediction was that, especially with the military in Hexeth, and they don't the leadership now not being particularly intuitively aligned with Ukraine, and with Elon Musk being the de facto dictator in the US at the moment, you and him not being aligned with Ukraine and being much more pro-Russian, being compromised by Russia and China and his businesses that take natural resources from China and Russia. He's got unfettered business access to China in a way that no other corporate entity does. And what's a quid pro quo there? So one thing I was predicting is that Starlink would be turned off for Ukraine. And if that's the case, there could be some serious issues. Now we're hearing Starlink is being turned off in Ukraine. The question is, we're hearing it from the Russians. Is this happening for the Ukrainians as well? Russian war blogger Roman Saponikov writes, by the way, it's interesting, an interesting fact, considering that today about 10% of all Starlink terminals were blocked across the entire front. And that's a lot, by the way. Tatiana Kruglova reports there was a mass blocking of Starlinks. Those who could activated new dishes today, those who couldn't delivered new terminals for tomorrow. And now, FU Elon Musk with such jokes. I feel like tomorrow will be a fun day. Uh, uh, obviously sarcastic there. Designers Dead End says, our boy Donald Trump has requested our boy Ilya Maskov to block Starlinks, that's Musk, in the combat zone. We are investigating the situation as many dishes have been blocked at once, but not all. Starlink is used widely by the Ukrainian military, which acquired it with funding provided by the Biden administration. It's not clear whether Trump will continue this. That's the important point. So what happened is, as Musk was being more and more difficult with Ukraine, the DoD had to take over and in fact, Musk started a military imprint, if you like, of his business. Starshield was it? That was that allowed it to do contracts directly with the DoD. The DoD took over the running and the subscriptions to all of these Starlinks that were previously being provided by Musk himself. Now, we might, if that stops, if the DoD stops that provision, and considering they're stopping all other kind of aid by the looks of it, at least at the moment, then that's pretty plausible. Then Ukraine is in an absolute ton of trouble. Starlink is used widely by the Ukrainian military, which acquired it with funding provided by the Biden administration. It's not clear whether Trump will continue this. The Russians have also acquired Starlink terminals on the black market through third countries. As Saponkov points out, the Russian site Panorama posted a story labeled as satire 2 weeks ago, which claimed, quote, US President Donald Trump signed an executive order banning the use of American communication systems in areas where active hostilities are underway. In practice, this means the cessation of operations of all Starlink systems on both the Ukrainian and Russian sides. Elon Musk in turn wrote on X social network that everything had been prepared in advance and the systems would be turned off within 24 hours. Such a decision, according to him, will contribute to the rapid onset of peace. The lack of Starlink communications will significantly weaken the ability of both sides to conduct military operations and push them towards peace negotiations. This is what we are achieving together with President Trump and the sensible part of humanity, he announced. So how true that is of course up for grabs, but you can imagine this would be a really big piece of leverage if you wanted Ukraine to go to negotiating table, irrespective of whether you wanted them to be in a power position or not. In other words, exactly exactly what I said, that the US under Trump doesn't really care about Ukraine. It cares about finishing the war. So it doesn't want a just and sustainable peace. It just wants peace. Like, if you don't care about Ukraine's outcomes here, then you can use Starlink as a massive freaking lever, right? This is a piece of leverage that is absolutely huge. There's no evidence that Trump has signed such an order, and Musk hasn't posted anything like that, but the Russians speculate that an attempt to degrade both sides' communications has in fact happened. However, there are no reports yet that Ukraine's access has been degraded. A possible alternative scenario is that Starlink has been able to identify the black market terminals acquired by the Russians and has been able to deactivate a significant number of them remotely without affecting the Ukrainian side. Now, that would be brilliant. So the best news here would be the Russians stop having access to Starlink and the Ukrainians continue. If that happens, brilliant stuff. America's done the right thing, and Musk's done the right thing, or Starlink's done the right thing, and that's long overdue. Why didn't happen previously? Okay, but if we are seeing the lack of Starlink access for both sides, this is a much bigger problem for Ukraine than for Russia. Ukraine use way more Starlinks than Russia. Now, Oleg Kutkov gives us an indication of how many Starlinks Ukraine use. So he says, "You probably know I'm doing volunteer Starlink repairs, which might look great, but I can't do many repairs. I still have a daytime job, other projects, and research activity. I decided it was much more important to share the knowledge. We currently have dozens of service centers and rework labs here in Ukraine. Today, I would like to tell you more about this. My friend runs a first in Ukraine, most likely in the world, and the biggest service center specializing in Starlink. He said this wouldn't have been possible without my research, articles, and support. I would say that all of this is impossible without the people doing all these repairs and working around the clock. Deepest respect to them all. Currently, they are doing almost 100 Starlink repairs per week. So here, these guys just repairing Starlinks on behalf of the Ukrainians. Now, it gets interesting a little further down. First of all, I'll just say this. Additionally, they are modifying and producing automotive versions of Rev 3, Rev 4, and mini terminals. This includes custom housing, mounting options, and versatile powering solutions, all for militaries. A lot of rapid and sometimes unique solutions. So there you go. So that's what he's doing. But it's in the discussion below this that I found some really interesting detail. Oh, where's it gone now? I bet it's in answer to this one. Um, yes. So someone said, "Have you read the Crusoe Wiki thread?" He said, "Yes, too early to comment on this topic now." But then hundreds of Starlinks are coming for repairs a week. Damaged in war or faulty ones, 99% were damaged on the front line. Then someone says, "How many dishes do you estimate to be in Ukraine?" And he said, 150,000. I'll share some numbers, including financials soon. They might shock someone. So the amount of money the US DoD is going to be spending on these subscriptions monthly is going to be phenomenal. This is one of the main tools that Ukraine uses to have communications, target acquisition, and all that kind of stuff, I presume, thrown in there. Starlinks are insanely useful. I saw adaptive Starlinks being placed on top of unmanned ground drones when I was in a workshop in Lviv, right? And they are that important. And if the US wants leverage, they can switch that off. 150,000 Starlinks like that. This is deeply worrying. Now, I'm not saying this has happened, but I am deeply worried that this might well be just about to happen or happening to Ukrainian Starlink access. If that's the case, oh, very dear. It's a real issue there. Yeah, there you go, and that's more stuff on your man David Lammy that I mentioned earlier. So anyway, that's the end of that. This is the military aid update that I think has gone a little bit into geopolitics, because I think we need to understand NATO, we need to understand Europe and the US, and what the position is in this game of chess where many of the pieces of the board seem to have been thrown up in the air. And we're just trying to work out what's going on, where the US sits. They have their own domestic agenda in Project 2025 that does not accord with their previous geopolitical objectives of the world. A much more insular, isolationist, America First agenda, where they don't want to be spending money on soft power projection through USA. They don't want to be spending money on Ukraine unless they get stuff back for it, unless it makes them a profit. So they're talking more about immediate gains rather than long-term geopolitical strategic gains. That is less important to the present administration, and that will change the way that the US goes about supporting or not supporting Ukraine. And as a result, the EU, the UK, and maybe Japan, Australia will have to start really filling in that vacuum. The question is, do we have the ability and the political willpower and the public support to be able to do that? Because it will be very, very costly. Um, the only other option for Ukraine, as I see it, is just prostituting themselves to the US and saying, "Help yourselves to our rare earth metals. Will essentially um, buy stuff from you in return for all of our goods and resources from within our borders." That may offer a bit of hope for continued aid from the US, or the US might just come up good strategically. We're yet to see. Anyway, let me know what you guys think. Thank you so much for watching. Please take care, and I'll speak to you soon.